So what I would like for you to put in the chat box is, what risky thing have you personally done recently? Oh, downhill skiing, adopting a rescue dog, across the street. Oh, fell on ice. Walked on slippery surfaces, winter driving, left the house, winter driving, traveled. Okay, winter makes things a bit risky. And as people are filling that in, the other thing, just to kind of get our minds thinking about risk and risk assessment and risk management, I'd also like for you to put in the chat box, why you took this risk. And while people are putting that in, here's a picture of me paragliding over Cape Town. And while this may seem like a risky endeavor, actually the most risky thing I feel I do on a somewhat regular basis is, I don't know if people recognize that, but this is a can of sweetened condensed milk. And so there are times when I'm licking this lid where I think I could have some negative consequences here, but it's worth it. So people talk about benefits of vacation outweigh the risk, getting the mail, leisure activities. So again, understanding we, for the most part, take these risks for the positive consequences of why we're doing things. And now, just to get us kind of now focused on professionally, what risk assessment and management means. We've got in the chat box, if you could just say professionally, what are you concerned about when you describe someone as living at risk? Safety, health and safety, hurting themselves, preventing harm, well-being, quality of life, risk of illness, falls, injury, at risk of injury. And then the last thing, again, just to kind of situate our thinking around risk assessment, what has been your risk journey professionally? My risk journey started with a reflection on not feeling well prepared as a clinician to deal with sort of two main conversations. So on the one hand, I had caregivers who would say to me, you need to move my mom ASAP, she's living at risk. And I would sort of follow up and say, well, what is the risk? And then the caregiver would say, well, her house is dirty. And certainly, we don't relocate people for dirty houses. But what if the dirt is mouse poop in the microwave that the client uses to heat up their food? I mean, that's a different scenario. And then on the other hand, the other conversations I was having is, caregivers saying my mom is living at risk, I'm her power of attorney, and them asking me, when is it neglect on their part? And certainly I think as clinicians, we think about when is it neglect on our part when we're supporting our patients or our clients to do things that would lead to some negative consequences. And it was these conversations that made me want to look into risk in a bit more detail. And it also had me reflect on me as a clinician of perhaps why I was feeling inadequate. So I had felt I'd become desensitized to situations. So I was seeing situations and always kind of saying, well, I've seen worse. Sometimes I felt I was hiding behind what I would call the cloak of client-centeredness. So I was very quickly attributing, their decisions, supporting what they felt that they wanted due to kind of a high value placed on autonomy. But what made me kind of reflect on that was I underestimating risk in these situations and supporting a higher risk situation than what I should do as a clinician? So these were kind of the thoughts that sort of led me on to doing some further research in risk. So in terms of today's objectives, we're going to look at sort of a primer on risk with regards to living with risk and resilience, and that we will move into then a four-step approach to risk assessment, and specifically focusing in at the end on some reflection we can do as clinicians, and how do we communicate risk with people with cognitive impairment. So what do we know about living with risk? What we do know is that home is where the majority of older adults want to remain for as long as possible, even if their health changes. And it's also where the majority of older adults want to be discharged to following hospitalization. However, there are many factors involved in making decisions around remaining at home. And this is a systematic review of 88 studies leading to 86 factors that go into making a decision of remaining at home amongst sort of 6 dimensions: social, built environment, time and space, economic, socioeconomic and health, psychological, and psychosocial. And why I highlight this is just how complex it is for people to make that decision. But there are only actually 2 areas that health professionals actually provide some information in. So just how complex this decision is, and yet we're just a very small part of and piece of that. What is the other thing? Like, what do we hear? So we hear inpatient managers say, you know, staff are delaying discharge when there are safety concerns. We hear community managers say, you know, acute care is not discharging patients home. And we have patients say, you know, staff are spending too much time focusing on the risks and things I can't do and not what I can do. And for those of us who work in the community, you know, we definitely hear, you know, our old adult clients say, I'm leaving this house, you know, feet first and in a box. So what are the results? Well, in some situations, patients don't go home who want to go home. When patients do go home or who are living at home, caregivers are stressed. In both of these scenarios, clinicians have moral distress. These are the clients that sort of keep us up at night. These are the clients that we think about, you know, days, weeks, months later. And definitely, it can have an impact on patient flow. So what do we know about risk and clinicians? So what we know is that as clinicians, we define risk negatively. We define living at risk negatively. We define living at risk differently. We have a tendency to focus on the negative consequences of taking the risk, as well as the physical consequences. But what we found in the first study on risk is that as clinicians, we assess risk comprehensively. So we'll go through each of these now in a moment. So why is it hard to support older adults to live with risk? Well, certainly there's the tensions of the bioethic principles. So on the one hand, we're trying to do good and do no harm at the same time as trying to support our clients' right to self-determination and decision-making. There are also tensions around decision-making, and we certainly have seen that more recently where as clinicians, we tend to approach the therapeutic clinical relationship with a rational decision-making approach. So we value science, we value evidence, we look at the pros and cons, whereas not everyone approaches decision-making from a rational standpoint. And sometimes we make decisions from an emotional standpoint. There's also tensions in the outcomes. As clinicians, we hope and want the best for our patients and our clients, but sometimes we have to support, you know, the minimum requirements of living, and that's hard to see and experience. It's also hard because goals of care differ between clients, caregivers, and clinicians when there are safety concerns. So again, we come to that clinical table with different goals, which makes for some complicated conversations. So what are the solutions? So the solutions are clinicians are better able to support older adults living with risk when they can broaden their definition of risk, when they can broaden their definition of living at risk, when they can clarify their definition of risk, and when they can broaden their approach to risk assessment, which includes shared decision-making. So what does that look like? When I've asked clinicians to define risk, clinicians have no trouble providing a definition somewhat similar to the one here from the Oxford Dictionary. So risk is the possibility that something unpleasant or unwelcome will happen. It's a situation involving exposure to danger. And certainly we hear the phrase on almost a daily basis when we talk about the risks and benefits of X or Y and Z. So this further demonstrates how we see as clinicians risk as being only negative. So if we see risk as negative, why would we want to support our older adult patients to live with risk? But if we can adopt a more neutral definition where we can acknowledge that risk has both negative and positive consequences, we are better able to support living with risk. And this is a definition from the business literature that deals with risk on a regular basis. And if we can move to a more neutral definition, then we really should be changing that last phrase to, well, what are the harms and benefits of X and Y? We also want to broaden our definition of living at risk. So in this first study I did on risk, the clinicians talked about living at risk as a judgment about an impairment within an environment that can cause a perilous event that has the increased potential for a negative consequence. But if we can move that to a more neutral definition where we are encouraging to support living with risk and acknowledging that we all live with risk, as we sort of indicated at the beginning of the talk today. And so what does that look like? So if we're supporting living with risk, we're supporting care that is focused on optimizing health, leveraging their strengths, adapting their environments, minimizing concerns, minimizing negative consequences, highlighting and augmenting any positive consequences, and acknowledging that there are both physical and emotional consequences to risk-taking. And what about clarifying risk? So we may not be surprised that clinicians, caregivers, and older adults have different ideas of what risk is. What did surprise me was in the first study on risk is that healthcare practitioners all define risk differently. So again, if you're having conversations with your team, are you talking about the same thing? So clinicians, some of them refer to as the situation being risky due to impairments, some due to the environment, whether it was physical, social, or economic. Some people describe living at risk related to events, and some describe living at risk related to consequences. So again, when you're talking about a client that you're concerned about in terms of risk, what are you referring to? And then in the most recent study, we kind of changed some of the wording to from the events to be, these are the concerns we want to focus in on that are caused by certain elements and factors that have some consequences. And so we'll come back to that. So what does a broadening your risk assessment look like? So it's acknowledging that there are both physical and emotional consequences of any decision. So when we're recommending relocation from home due to some physical consequences of some concerns, are we also in those conversations acknowledging that there are emotional consequences of not remaining at home? The other thing that we do is we're very clear as clinicians on what are the risks of going home, but in those conversations, are we also balancing an understanding of what are the risks for this person of remaining in hospital? And lastly, we want to acknowledge that there are both negative and positive consequences of risk-taking and a broadened approach to risk assessment. So what are the benefits of living with risk? One thing for sure is that resilience can only come about by taking a risk or overcoming a challenge. It is a process by which people bounce back from adversity, reintegrate, and ideally grow from experience. So if you can think about some of the hardest things that you've done in your life to date, have these been associated with opportunities of growth? And there has been a lot of literature with kids and older adults in terms of restriction of being able to take risks. And the results of that research have shown, specifically in kids, where there's increased anxiety, increased depression, and decreased resilience. And we're also seeing the same in research in older adults. So they've shown where high resilience later in life has been associated with reduced depression, increased quality of life, and improved lifestyle behaviors. So when we're looking at supporting our older adult patients to live with risk, is this an opportunity to help build and support resilience? The other thing about risk, a broadened approach to risk assessment, is that it must include shared decision-making. So as clinicians, we come to the table with experts in illness, disease, causes, resources, how to adapt activities. As we mentioned earlier, we're very much aware of what are the negative consequences. But as we talked about at the very beginning in terms of why we take risks as people and individuals, where we typically take risks for the positive consequences, we require the clients and the caregivers to participate in that conversation, because it's only them that can actually define what that reward is. What are the positives of taking this risk? That is not something that we can actually know or weigh in on. So they come to the table with experts in their life, their values, their beliefs, their goals, their dreams, defining what that reward and positive consequences are. So how do we support living with risk? The Living with Risk decision support tool was developed out of a qualitative study of community practicing clinicians who were asked how they assess and manage risk. And that tool has most recently, with generous funding from the Canadian Frailty Network, was adapted to the hospital environment and validated and tested in both the hospital and community. And then actually this week, we're starting recruitment for an implementation study where we will look at, well, what are the barriers and facilitators to implementation to make any revisions to the tool and develop an implementation guideline. As with all evidence-informed practice, we require input from clinicians, clients, and the research. And so this tool has had input from 187 clinicians, 28 older adults, and 14 caregivers, 14 researchers, in addition to the literature. The Living with Risk decision support approach is based on the following guiding principles. It is first and foremost a decision support tool. So that means it is aimed to increase or improve or affect our clinical decision-making and also support communication. It is based on several practical approaches. The comprehensive geriatric assessment is a holistic review of an individual, and certainly the same is required for the risk assessment, as well as the CGA's kind of root causal approach to analysis to optimize the health function and safety of an older adult. It's also based on the dignity of risk, which is a concept that supports that we are all living with risk and that we all have the right to succeed and the right to fail. And it's also based on therapeutic risk-taking, which highlights the benefits of taking risks. As I mentioned, it does require shared decision-making with all clients, and where permission has been given involving the caregiver. And it's certainly focused on the values, beliefs, and what matters most to our patient and clients. So it is a four-step approach, broken down into both a risk assessment and risk management piece. And we'll just go through each of those steps next. But there are a few worksheets that accompany the approach to help operationalize it. So there is an information sheet. There is a fillable risk analysis worksheet that, in filling out these boxes, automatically fills in a summary table. And there is a safety continuum that helps with step 2 in terms of risk analysis. So step 1 is focused on really clarifying what is the older adult at risk of and who is concerned. As I mentioned earlier, healthcare practitioners all define risk differently. So it's really helping focus those conversations on what exactly are we concerned about and getting some agreement and coherence around that. So a person is at risk of a concern within a certain context. Clarifying who is concerned. Is it the patient, the family? Is it yourself as the clinician? Understanding what the causes are of this concern and what are the consequences. So an example would be, we're concerned about someone who's falling in the context of getting up to the washroom at night. We hypothesize that some of the causes could be poor balance, poor vision, polypharmacy. And in this individual, we're concerned about a hip fracture as a consequence of the fall. So the next focus is on then who is concerned. As we indicated, there are multiple meanings of risk and we all define risk differently. Patients as themselves rarely sort of identify to us that they're concerned about risk and how can we help them. They're certainly focused on this is the life they've been living and the choices they've been making. They only tend to refer to themselves as being at risk when it pertains to situations outside of themselves, such as living in a risky neighborhood. In a more recent study, taking risks with ordinary activities were very much related to values. And again, this was a study that interviewed 80 to 100-year-old people participating in ordinary activities and why they were making certain choices. And it certainly, it was stemmed back to some of their values. There is conflicting research on whether caregivers and or clinicians are more risk averse. But family members have a tendency to focus on the present and how it affects the client's interpersonal relationships. And then clinicians, as we indicated earlier, they have a tendency to focus on physical consequences, the negative consequences, but also the future consequences. And they also have a tendency to overestimate risk. And then think personally how you evaluate risk and whether that's impacting on some of the decisions you make. In the study I did with the community practicing clinicians, the more experience they had, the more comfortable they were with tolerating their clients to take risks, and the closer they were to 65, the more they were able to tolerate their clients' risk taking. And certainly in the literature, if there's a threat of litigation, that definitely influences your decisions and how you support risk taking. The second step is understanding what is the older adult's risk status. And that is trying to determine, is this a low, medium, or high risk situation, as that will also sort of inform some of the steps that you recommend. How do you currently assess an older adult's risk status? Well, certainly in the business literature, they really look at two factors. They look at what is the likelihood of this happening and what are the severity of the consequences. And it kind of forms into a similar table like this. But what our study found was that actually clinicians look at 8 different factors to determine, is this a low, medium, or high risk situation? So if we think about falls as the example, the first question is this older adult capable to make these decisions, healthcare decisions? And certainly if the client is determined as being capable, that might be considered low risk versus if they're not. The next is this concern occurring now? So are they currently falling? So low risk would be no, medium risk might be, yes, they have risk factors, versus high risk, yes, they are current falling. As we all sort of know, someone who's a good predictor of future falls or current falls. And then what is the likelihood of this concern and or consequences to occur? So is this unlikely, moderately likely, or highly likely? So again, for someone who's currently falling, what is the likelihood of them to continue to fall? And what is the likelihood of the consequences to occur? what is the severity of the consequences? So we all know someone who falls, you could have no injury, to someone who falls and has a catastrophic head injury. How imminent are the consequences of the concern? So things like consequences from fires or falls can happen immediately, which might be higher risk than something like malnutrition that the consequences take a long time for them to occur. How often is this concern happening? So someone who's falling yearly is a different picture than someone who's falling monthly, which is different than someone who's falling daily. And here's where we consider a person's level of support in terms of making the situation less risky or more risky. So does the older adult have consistent, reliable support in place? And certainly people that do, we can bring that risk right down to low. And complexity. So someone who is just falling is a different picture than someone who's falling. We're worried about malnutrition. We're worried about falls. We're worrying about elder abuse. So the more concerns occurring, certainly the higher risk that clinicians would rate it. And once we've determined the risk level of risk, we then are trying to determine, what can be done about the concerns. So first and foremost, what does the older adult want? And then what can be done about the concerns, causes, and consequences? So if we bring this figure back, we highlight on the concern and think about, are there ways that we can prevent the concern, such as the fall, or can we minimize the frequency of the falls? What can be done to adapt or modify the context in which these concerns happen? And what can we do to address the causes? Can we address the impairments? Can we optimize them? Can we enhance or leverage the client's strengths? Can we adapt the environments or the activities? And where can we minimize the negative consequences, augment the positive consequences, and ensure that we're weighing both the emotional and physical consequences of the concerns? And then who is concerned? Highlighting who is concerned in these situations helps us understand who needs interventions or recommendations or suggestions. And step 4 is how to have a conversation about risks and ways to address these concerns. So certainly it's understanding and establishing the priorities by focusing on what matters most to the individual. It's also about supporting these conversations. Many of the clinicians talked about not knowing how to start these conversations or how to structure them or what information to include in them. And then it's really understanding where there are different of opinions, why are there difference of opinions, and trying to understand what lies behind that. Some of the worksheets have been used to help with the conversation. So here's an example of the risk analysis worksheet, where as a clinician, you would work through filling out each part. So we're concerned about falls in the context of urinating at night. We're thinking about the cause of the concern as being related to poor vision, polypharmacy, poor balance, with the potential consequence of this concern being a hip fracture. We're looking at rating the older adult's risk status, where the clinician rated it as medium, the older adult wasn't concerned, and the caregiver rated it as medium. Then in terms of recommendations, a suggestion was to put in a nightlight, which the client agreed, do a medication review for the polypharmacy, which they agreed, a recommending of using a walker, which the client didn't agree. So it was sort of having conversations about perhaps then using a cane. And this was all with incorporating the older adult's perspective of understanding that they wanted to remain at home, and the walker in this case didn't fit in the client's washroom. And in filling out this worksheet, it automatically fills in the summary table. And so this might be our concern around falls, but we might have other concerns that we would put on the summary table and bring to the conversations with the older adult. And just to highlight here, in terms of the second column of who is concerns, when we talk to the older adults about the summary table, if there was anything that they wanted added or removed, it was too complex. They wanted all this information, and they also liked having the understanding of differences of opinions that people had, and the understanding the reasons why behind that. So the older adults, when we interviewed them about these conversations and what they wanted, what was important for them and what they wanted covered, they really wanted to make sure that we knew that they wanted the focus to be on quality of life over safety. They wanted us to focus on what can be done, not what can't be done. They really wanted to have be a participant in those conversations, and they wanted to understand the rationale for why we had certain impressions as clinicians or why we were making certain recommendations. And here's some quotes from them in terms of the focus on positivity, providing the rationale, and the importance of shared decision-making. So one older adult said, yeah, it seemed to be they were focusing too much on the negative and not enough on what can be done. Another older adult said, I'd really like to know the rationale for why I'm not able to do what I want to do. And another one talking about the shared decision-making process. Well, I think it should be a group effort in consultation with the doctor, the clinician, the caregiver, and the patient. Depending on how the patient is, they should all be consulted and shared in the decision-making. Here's some more quotes from the older adults around the importance of cooperative decision-making, collaborative decision-making, and again, positivity. So one older adult said, I thought that they handled things pretty fairly. They listened to what I had to say, and I didn't want them to boss me around, so to speak. They listened to what I had to say, and they cooperated with me. And in that respect, I was quite satisfied. Another older adult said, I think that a positive attitude shown by the people involved, including myself, is a big benefit, and any negativity should be set aside and mentioned, but not insisted on, type of thing. You know, I think that being positive about the whole situation is quite an asset. And the last quote here is an older adult saying, well, definitely it's my life and it's my decision. And I just wanted to make sure that they understood where I was coming from, and it really went fairly smoothly. Everyone had their input, including myself. And older adults talking about cooperative decision-making. Yeah, I think it's important that as a cooperative endeavor, not the clinician or whatever sits there with a tick sheet. I would probably want to actually see the form and see what we're looking at and see what we're doing. Not be spoken at, but sort of more with. And the collaborative decision-making was talked about again. Well, what I like about it, it's sort of a summary of probably a number of conversations that have happened over a period of time, and perhaps a client like me wouldn't remember necessarily. So it's really helpful to have it all in one place and have it really reviewed, because I think that would help me to agree with what perhaps is being suggested because it's there. And that was them talking about the summary table. So what other feedback did we get from the clinicians and the older adults from the most recent study of reviewing the tool and having it used with them in clinical situations? So as I mentioned, the older adults and caregivers really wanted to understand the rationale behind the decisions. They wanted to be involved in the decision-making, that they liked that this tool provided an opportunity for a safe space for divergent perspectives. They wanted to know their options, and they really talked about the importance of the therapeutic relationship in terms of being heard, being supported, instilling hope, and being positive and focusing on things, on solutions. Clinicians were asked to provide input on the fit, the usefulness, the impact, and improvements to the tool. So in terms of the fit, it fit with working in both the hospital and the community setting. And they also talked about the tool or the approach allowing for an opportunity for hearing the divergent perspectives. They found it was useful in terms of clarifying, confirming, developing, structuring, supporting clinical thinking. It helped clarify, focus, initiate, structure, and support communication. In terms of outcomes, it helped find solutions, supported decision-making, and address moral distress. In terms of processes, it helped confirm, evaluate, formalize, justify discharge planning. It structured processes, it supported reassessment, and it supported communication along the continuum of care. In terms of, we'll provide some of these quotes from the clinician. I'll just pick the middle one here. So with one of my caregivers, and I think it helped her feel validated that her concerns are also the concerns of the clinician, and that she has a valid reason why she has those concerns. So I think just it made her feel good. And at the end, when I asked her, I was like, okay, she said, oh, that tool was great. In terms of the impact, as we indicated, the clinicians also felt it facilitated improved conversation, sharing of information for the client, understanding the rationale behind the decisions, and encouraging a collaborative conversation. And for the clinician, it helped them improve confidence, validate their decision-making, and increased clarity of thinking. And here are some of the quotes around the impact. But we'll just move along. So, they did gave some great feedback around improvements. And in the step one, in terms of who is concerned, they wanted more on to help them reflect on as a clinician. And they also wanted to have more information on how to have a conversation about risk for people with cognitive impairment. So we'll cover those right now. So in terms of clinical reflection, as I mentioned, they wanted more guidance around self-reflection of when they were concerned. As we indicated in step 3, we're identifying interventions for the patient and caregiver, but what are the situations where we as clinicians need interventions? So we want to come to the clinical therapeutic table with our own tools to facilitate a balanced risk assessment. Rather than sometimes we have our own obstacles to being able to provide a balanced approach to risk assessment, which can lead us to overestimate the risk and thus overprotect the patient on the one hand, or perhaps we have become desensitized to the situation and underestimate the risk. Both of these dichotomies have the potential for increased negative consequences. So when we're reflecting, we do have to understand that we operate within a society that is more risk averse. This is due to technology where if we think about when we used to not know information, we would write away for an answer. It would take several weeks for us to get the answer back. And in that time, we would have to kind of wait in the limbo land of uncertainty. But think about now when we're wanting an answer, we send out an email, and think about the time that we would like that answer back. Or even when we're texting and we're looking for the 3 dots. So we're wanting more immediate input and feedback. And so we're less skilled at existing in that land of uncertainty. The other piece of is the location of practice. So if we think about where we're practicing, it has an impact on how we manage and assess risk. So in the hospital, we work as a team. And as each clinician works on different aspects of the patient health, we all come to the team discussions with different priorities. We're also assessing the patient while they're still unwell, assessing in an unfamiliar environment on an unknown or uncertain recovery trajectory, having to predict what may or may not work. There's delays in community services, and the feedback loop is always negative. So if you think about it, you don't see the people who are succeeding at living with risk. You're only seeing the people who are coming back to the hospital. And on top of all that, typically the hospital is very hyper-focused on patient safety, and rightly so. Versus if you're working in the community, you're better able to understand how things are going with the client. You're able, for those who are able to follow the patient over time, they can definitely support a higher risk. And lastly, when we think about ourselves as clinicians, again, what are our beliefs about risk? What are our tolerances for risk? Are we spending all our time on reducing our own discomfort? What are our mental models? Do we believe in shared decision making? Do we look at things as an either or, either safe or autonomous versus a both and situation? So how do we both support safety and autonomy? And in our efforts to reduce the uncertainty of the situation, do we over reduce? So do we reduce our thinking too quickly with a confirmation bias, which is when we're looking for information to back up our hypothesis or decisions? Do we go into decision-making process with a predetermination of what we believe or want to happen, and then only see the answers we want to see? So a broadened approach to risk assessment requires an infinite mindset. By not being dichotomous or binary so quickly, it allows for more creativity and problem solving. And then the last piece was on that they asked for was risk communication within dementia care. And so I've highlighted some of the research that's been done actually over in Ireland. So what they're saying is the importance of reaching a shared understanding of the concerns and consequences. What a shared understanding of what are the approaches to the risk of harm, and what are the acceptable thresholds and or tipping points for both the client and the caregiver. It's also important to not only know the patient for creative and person-centered approaches, but also knowing the caregiver and acknowledging their fears, their feelings, and their belief systems. They certainly talk about the importance of active decision-making that focuses on solutions, and providing that time for the client and the caregiver to process, to make choices, to understand, and to adapt to these changes. It's understanding that we're making these decisions most awfully in crisis times with kind of new changes to functional levels and trying to understand what that means. So at the end of the day, the Living with Risk Decision Support approach continues to show that it improves clinical thinking, improves communication, and improves shared decision making. And this has been consistent across the last 2 studies. So it's a holistic, structured, systematic review of an older adult's risk status that identifies potential strategies that decrease negative consequences, focuses on what are the positive consequences by addressing impairments, leveraging strength, and adapting environments, all while acknowledging the older adult's decision and choices. It's an objective tool to help with discharge and care planning discussions by framing information that you're already gathering, ensuring that a wide variety of risk categories are addressed, and supporting a balanced problem-solving approach. And I just wanted to kind of give one of the last words to one of the older adults about the importance of instilling hope, focusing on what people can do, positivity, leveraging strengths. So in general, I have a lot of problems that drag me down or make me feel ill, basically, because I can't handle them. And then she'll give me some sort of little tip on phoning a certain person or something, or else an answer that doesn't completely depress me. And then you feel you have the guts that it's not possible, that it's not impossible. Then you feel like there's hope. They can solve these problems, one by one, instead of not solving them at all. So I don't give up. And just in terms of some next steps, so as I mentioned, we're embarking on recruiting 30 clinicians if anyone's interested in an implementation study on using the tool in routine practice for 2 months. There'll be training, access to worksheets, the instruction guide, and an implementation guide. And future steps, so as you can see, we need more input from older adults, and we like to do that with a decisional needs assessment, so really understanding from them, what decisions do they feel they have to make? What information do they need? Where are there sort of the decisional conflicts around that, and how we can kind of work to overcome that? And then a future outcome, a randomized control trial. And certainly Just want to not only thank the older adults and clinicians who participated in the research study, but certainly all this information has been developed by a community of knowledge users and clinicians, and certainly we acknowledge and are grateful for the funding that we got from the Canadian Frailty Network.
We do have more events coming up. You're welcome to look at our website, www.rgpo.com/events, to view and register for any upcoming events. Thank you, Heather, one more time for doing this excellent talk and helping us understand how we live at risk and how that impacts our older adults. And have a lovely week, starting off with a great Monday morning.